So, Jared, welcome to the Inside Scoop today. The Inside Scoop is the stories behind and analytics behind how companies truly grow. And we hear from top founders, investors, and operators. And Jared, super excited to have you on today.
Hey, Janet, thank you very much for having me. Really excited to be here.
Awesome. To start with, could you introduce the audience yourself to the audience and go over your background and kind of what led you to become an operator in the tech world?
Absolutely. So I started my career as an entrepreneur. I started a few different companies, import and export, wine, food, had a last mile business, an e-commerce site. And with each iteration of the businesses I created, grew closer and closer to a lot of the vendors that I kept finding myself using. And I had a mentor at one point who kept talking about this concept of being on top of an ecosystem rather than in it, selling the shovels and the picks instead of going to look for gold, for example. And early on, I realized that's where I wanted to be. That's tech industry in Silicon Valley, and I moved out here about almost 10 years ago now, and I haven't looked back. And since moving out here and getting into SaaS a couple of years ago, 10 years ago, I've touched on large companies like Salesforce of the world, where I worked in sales and pre-sales, and then moved over and led a corporate strategy and go-to-market strategy function for them as well. And then smaller companies and private equity and venture capital companies like Reputation and so on. That's me in a nutshell. I've kind of been around. I've had every sales role that there is in a company and a number of the marketing roles too. And I'm excited to talk more about this.
Yeah, so really excited to start, especially just diving into some of the metrics. So you've worked with high growth companies, you've worked in large industries, from the Salesforce to the Reputations. How can you go over a bit more how maturity models influence what metrics a company should focus on, from the early stage companies that you've worked with to some of the later stage?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's a couple different ways you can think about this. One is where the business sits in its life cycle, like what you just said, early to late stage. Another one is what's the goal? And is it is it private? Is it public? Who are the owners? A company that is purely targeting bottom line growth will have a different set of metrics capabilities than a company that is targeting rapid top line growth. This should go without saying. And so what you evaluate and the decisions you make coming out of that would be different in both of those camps. And then the decision can even further be fractalized by breaking it out into early stage, mid stage, late stage, mature, prime, and so on businesses. And so it's a really large matrix of types of things that companies care about. And of course, there's things that matter across the board. Look, revenue matters. Well, how much are we bringing in over what time period? That will matter no matter which box you're in on that matrix. Other things that matter, that are always going to matter, are customer acquisition costs. Whether you're a scaled business or not, you're still going to have to make sure that you have a budget and you plan for that budget. Now, you may have different metrics and different categories of metrics that you care about. For example, your LTV and your CAC to LTV ratios are going to be different. Your target ratios are going to be different if you're trying to grow top line versus bottom line. If you're trying to expand into new markets versus retain a core business, different numbers that you'll have in these cells, more or less. However, the cells are the same and the values are the same and what you're targeting is the same. I spend a lot of time looking at what are the key metrics sales leaders should care about today. The most important one that I'm seeing in 2024 is what's your win rate? Because what that comes back to is what's your conversion rate? Do you have the right ICP? Are you selling to that ICP well? Are you targeting the right customers? It all comes back to those. And identifying win rate problems is the first way to start moving down that stack.
That makes a lot of sense. And one of the curious things that I've seen, you've worked both in sales and revenue operations. So you've been both the person who's responsible for the number being the sales, and then you've been the person responsible for the number being putting the reports together. How has that shifted your perspective for both revenue operations and sales, having worked on both sides of the table?
Can I have a hot take here?
Go for it.
I think everyone who works in sales operations, revenue operations, they should sell before getting into those roles because nothing is purely statistics.
Do you have an example behind that?
Absolutely. So I'm thinking about enterprise business right now. There are businesses out there that are trying very hard to move up market. And they did so with a group of people who we're good early SMB, mid-market sellers, and with RevOps and sales ops teams that maybe had a decent experience in a really operational motion that is the SMB or PLG or even that mid-market outbound space. But when you start moving into enterprise, numbers start shifting. It becomes more expensive to sell. And if you do not understand where the pitfalls are in enterprise sales cycles and in building out a sales tech stack that better support that, you will spend a lot of money and not be very effective. There's a company I've spent some time talking with in the past few weeks that is doing some interesting stuff in go-to-market technology. And one of the difficulties that they've had has been how do they break an enterprise? And they realized they just weren't staffed right for it. And so now they're trying to think of what does that look like? Well, I'll speak from my own experience. When I come into a business that's looking to go up market, one of the first things I'm doing is doing a talent evaluation across the board on the sales and sales ops org. And I find people who have sold directly into enterprise before are more successful, both in terms of sales operations functions as well as the actual sales functions. One of the best hires I've made in my life was someone who he came out of consulting, and he went to a sales ops role working for me. However, in his previous job, you have to learn how to sell here in consulting. It's part of the job. And having those skill sets helps you understand what your customers want. Your customer and sales ops are the sellers. And so what do they want? What are their pain points? And having gone through that, you and I and we all become better at our jobs. One more point on this one is I saw something on LinkedIn. I'm a doom scroller on LinkedIn. That's my bad habit. Every night before bed and early in the mornings typically. And there was someone posted an image. The point was people buying decisions, behavioral decisions are driven by emotion 95% of the time. So if I tell you, hey, update these fields in Salesforce versus update these fields in Salesforce because otherwise Janet will have to do it for you over the weekend, which will drive more behavior? And so if you can have someone who's been in both sides of that and able to say, hey, here's the impact of it. Here's if you don't fill out these fields and things like super tactical, right? You don't do the right level of discovery. XYZ is going to happen. John Smith, Jane Doe are going to have these outcomes driven on them. I found that also can drive better behavior.
That's a really interesting point too, on not just explaining the what the outcome is, but explaining the why. And it sounds like, I feel like most of us have gotten some email on you've got to submit your timesheet by X, Y, and Z. And I do agree that I'd probably be much more compliant to somebody who said, all right, so, so-and-so in accounting is going to have to spend the weekend working versus another automated email saying, all right, don't forget to submit your timesheet where you already ignored them 3 times.
Yep. The second of the month email that you get every month, are there any outstanding invoices you haven't submitted? Without the follow-up of, by the way, if there are, you're going to make me have to work over the weekends and get yelled at by the CFO, which is going to drive me to respond better. Absolutely true.
Interesting. So I want to take another pivot. So I know you've had a lot of experience in international expansion, and you have some interesting thoughts on how it's changed over the past decade. Could you say a little bit more on kind of what's different from what you saw in the 2010s versus where we're sitting on almost 2025?
Absolutely. So in the early 10s, I guess I can say that, makes me feel old. The early 10s, I was spending a lot of time in the mobile app space and in advertising technology. And a general rule of thumb was when you had a new mobile product that you wanted to release, you would launch it in probably South Korea first. Relatively low cost sale with similar buying behaviors towards North America. Low customer acquisition costs, similar buying behaviors in North America. Then you launch it in Oceania, and then you launch it in Western Europe, and then you launch it in North America. More or less, that was the line of attack if you were launching products geared towards English-speaking audiences. Today, a couple things have happened. Costs all over the world have gone up from a customer acquisition perspective in every industry. So the advantage of some of these tertiary markets, secondary markets has decreased. B, AI and other tools have made it easier to take things to market. C, offshoring and nearshoring has changed, and you have to take into account your production and distribution models. So even if your product is code that you're building, it impacts what and how you deliver. And so I'm talking more and more with companies that are choosing to nearshore into LATAM and Central America for engineering. And then they have hubs there for content development and other things because it makes them easier to respond to customer needs in North American time zones. And so if you already have your engineering and your marketing and you started building out sales organizations here in North America, it makes it easier just to enter North America, whether or not your company was based in Berlin or Tel Aviv first. One thing that we saw in 2000 and I think it was 2019, 2020 was the impact of currency fluctuations on a business. Salesforce, Microsoft, two great examples that were hit really hard. It was lack of hedging, too much hedging. I don't know. I'm not an expert in currency trading. However, we saw both companies' stock prices get hit very heavily through this. What this brings to a point is where your cost and expense centers are in times when there is uncertainty around macroeconomic conditions. You want them to be closer together. So if you're bringing in money, you want to spend the money in that jurisdiction potentially to the best of your ability. More so than it was earlier, last decade or so, when things were way more stable macroeconomically and between countries that were generally considered friendly. So North America versus to Europe and vice versa.
Since you talked about macroeconomics and we're recording on November 7th, so we got an interesting, expected but interesting report on another quarter point interest rate cut. Any thoughts on how that'll impact the macroeconomics, microeconomics?
I don't, but here are the questions going through my head. It's going to stick. And I mean this genuinely. We hear there are a lot of rumblings. If you look at yield, both if you look at bond and other yield curves, if you look at housing, if you look at unemployment numbers, there seems to be, on one hand, a really strong case for the worst is behind us, and rates are going to keep getting cut over the next 3 to 4 quarters. But then if you listen to experts and you look at other metrics on Fred and other sources, you start wondering, is this not premature? And so is it going to stick is the question that I have. And as much as I hate to say this, and I would be hesitant about any significant investment over the next few months. Definitely as the current administration winds down during the lame duck presidency, moving into the next administration, I would be cautiously optimistic that things will improve because, hey, we just had this rate cut today, maybe there'll be another rate cut tomorrow. Probably not. I don't know what's going to happen once the next government and administration gets in place. So I'd just be cautious.
And that makes a lot of sense, especially in an era of so much change, just being very careful about where you're making the bets. Granted, this is sometimes where people make those really big bets that pay off, and other times it is beneficial to be more conservative.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you have to be conservative right now. It doesn't matter if the interest rates were just dropped by a quarter of a point. It was a quarter of a point. That matters on a very large scale to large companies. But the smaller businesses, it is a notch. It is not going to drive the difference between them being successful or them failing in most situations. And we just need to keep making the same decisions they were making based on the same information they had until there's some sense of normalcy. Otherwise, you risk making a bet that's going to cost you the company.
We've talked a little bit so far too about your early career in terms of how you got into both RevOps and sales, around how you've seen different international expansion. I'd be curious to hear more, especially in this changing economy. How do you see different roles changing? So you've been in RevOps a fair amount, you've been in sales. Will those roles change fundamentally, especially with the advent of AI? If so, what will change? If not, why will certain things stay the same?
Yeah, this is a hard one. And it's a hard one because not only do I think no one knows the answers, I also don't think anyone is going to like the answers when they end up coming. There's a whole camp of people who say that AI is going to wipe out insert career here, customer success, sales development. There's a whole group of people saying, no, all it'll do is augment the existing. And the reality is it's going to be neither and both. As always is. You can look at plows, you can look at electric lighting or factories and farms, and it changes the business more than anything else. It changes what the future is. I have a young child, and I look how he interacts with technology today. With anything that has a screen, he touches it with his hands and tries to move things around using his fingers. He's under 3. The idea of that didn't occur to me until I was a teenager when the first iPhone came out, however old I was then. I can't tell you what's going to happen with AI. All I can say for sure is that in the businesses where I have operational leadership, I make a point to try and question all the assumptions I had going into it. Do we need XYZ function in this business? Is there a way that we can execute XYZ function 80% using tools off the shelf and reposition these people to a place that is much more painful today? That means re-educating in some situations. Sometimes it means changing the people. Sometimes it means changing the roles. But it doesn't mean that wholeheartedly we don't have sales reps anymore, so, SDRs anymore, for example. Or how can we run an enterprise business without customer success people who will sit down with the customer and be the listening ear? Are we going to get there? Maybe. I don't know. I mean, there's some really good companies out there, like Eric Howard and others that are making ways to have interaction with customers via AI models. But I think sometimes, and I'm guilty of this, people just want to talk to another person. So I don't know. I think it'll be different than what anyone is expecting today.
Mhm. That's a really interesting point. And it's the future is coming quickly, but we don't know what train it's on.
Well, another good one is, people overestimate what they'll do in a year, underestimate what they'll do in 10.
Something like that.
Yeah, I think that's how this feels to me right now.
And it's interesting. One of the things that you did to position yourself for your own career was getting an MBA. I know that there's a lot of controversy over those, particularly in tech. Can you tell me why you decided to get one and what value you found?
Yeah, I found a tremendous amount of value. I'll start with that. So I got my MBA, the evening weekend program at UC Berkeley Haas School of Business. And the way the program works is you have a day job, and Tuesdays and Thursdays you're in class, and from 6 to 9:30, or Mondays and Wednesdays, and then sometimes weekends and sometimes block weeks here and there. And you got to figure that out with your family, with your job, but if that's the program. And then roughly 300 people or so each year make that work for them. It was a phenomenal program. I'll say a few things about it. One, I think the part-time program for working professionals is the way to go. I think the opportunity cost of quitting your job for 2 years is incredibly high, especially today in this job environment. If you have a job, you should probably try to keep it and leave only when you have something else lined up. So getting your MBA part-time is a way you can do that. I think it is incredibly difficult and it pushes you. My week would look like this. I would fly out to typically Houston on Sunday night for customer work on all day Monday, half day Tuesday. Tuesday afternoon, I'd fly to San Francisco, get to Berkeley 6:30 for class, leave Berkeley and fly back to Houston 11 o'clock at night on Tuesday night. Repeat that on Thursday to get back, and I'd be local customer office on Friday. That was my week normally. It is a tremendous amount of work. It puts amount of pressure on you and your family that you never knew you could handle, and it changes how you think about prioritization, which is the second benefit I think that exists from an MBA is you learn how to prioritize because there is no time. The only way to grow is through a gauntlet, is to pick your metaphor here. Which goes to the next one is there is more work around things that you have never dealt with before than you can handle. And so you are forced to make very strategic and specific decisions on how you deploy your time to learn and build new skills. I don't use the calculus that often in my day job. Sometimes I do, but rarely. I don't use, just a lot of the statistics work I did, even in RevOps. But I can speak the language and I understand what people are talking to. So when I sit down with the data scientists, I know what they're saying. When I sit down with my FP&A business partners, I know what they're talking about. I know what they care about. I can go to our CFO and talk in an intelligent way with him or her and have these conversations that matter with people who have been doing this for 20, 30 years. And not only not sound like an idiot, but actually help and contribute. The only ways of doing this are you start your own business and you get lucky that you're successful enough where you start dealing with these types of problems. Two, you build a career that over a long period of time where you do all of the things that want over a career path. Or three, you're told what they are and you're told how to think about them. The fast track is three. And I think investing in yourself is the best investment anyone can make. Finally, the network. It's not necessarily that you're going to get your next job from someone you go to class with, but you are surrounding yourself with people who are equally or more interested in self-development than you are willing to put the time in, willing to work hard. And it's a different breed of people who are willing to go way beyond their, the work week, double their work week effectively to try and better themselves. And it helps you as well become a more hardworking and focused person. I found that to be incredibly valuable.
Can you say a little bit more too about the relationships that you developed with your professors?
Yeah, absolutely. So, a few weeks ago, I sat down with my negotiations professor, and we had a coffee, talked about what their life is like now and how that classes impact mine. I found these relationships have been incredibly valuable in helping me think about complex decisions in my own career or in my life, job context. The people that you meet there will change your life. I had Dan Simpson was one of my professors, former chief strategy officer at Clorox, and he had a number of phrases and a number of frameworks he would use, and I think about them nearly daily, if I'm going to be honest with myself, because these are people who have been successful in their careers and in their lives and want to give back. And not only do they want to give back, they try to give back. Not only they try to give back, they're successful. And so having these people as my board of directors, as I like to call it, for my own career and my own life, I find it to be invaluable.
That makes a lot of sense. And it's really interesting. How do you, as you think through this, do you have any plans on ways that you want to keep in contact with them? I know that's something that, at least for a lot of my network, I have some friends who are just going back out on the job search after a layoff or after making a pivot. And they're like, wait, I haven't talked to these people since the last time I was doing a job search. Do you have
Yeah.
any advice or for people like that where they're working on keeping contact aside from just every time, either you're making a switch or you get a layoff?
Yeah, there's a couple of answers to that question. One is find a way to force it. One person I went to school, went to Berkeley with, he is now on the council for the alumni network and arranges golf tournaments or winery tours or speaking things, engagements, and so on for former students from his class and our class and others, which helps him tremendously to build out his network. And he said that he gave me a statistic of a certain number of people, and I don't remember who it was, but it's a couple dozen people in the last few months have found new jobs through the network. So that works. Another one is ancillary circles. So I run the RevOps Council for the Go-to-Market Leaders Society, for example. We hold these events for high-end leaders in the Bay Area, VPs plus companies, 100 people or more, who want to have real conversations with their peers. And we help enable that. And I bring in relevant people from Berkeley and other Bay Area and national MBA programs as well to be part of this, because it's a way that we can all expand our network. And we have these real conversations about what is hitting us today. We're having a dinner in a couple days, actually, to talk about AI and how do we elevate the role of RevOps into the boardroom and beyond. And so these are conversations that matter. They matter in everyone's day-to-day life, day-to-day work. And in addition to that, yeah, these are people who I'd love to work for or hire in the future as well.
That's interesting and a really great ways in order to stay connected. You can't, most of us have more than the standard 150. I think that's the number of people you can stay in contact with at any one point on LinkedIn, let alone the other social networks. And those are some really good tips to keep active.
That's a good number, 150. I feel lately that I can't even do a fraction of that. It seems that every interaction is taking more time and more energy. And I don't mean that as a negative. It's difficult to get to that type of volume, I think.
So you've touched on some of the personal stuff, and one of the things that you mentioned is becoming a father. How has becoming a father and making that step really changed your thought process about how you're thinking through your career?
Yeah. So I'll tell a story from earlier this year. So in the months leading up to my son's second birthday, I was on the road about 80 to 90. And I got back 3 weeks before his birthday, and he didn't want to spend time with me. He was aggressively pushing me away, wanted to spend time with his mom, was angry with me. And it took a while for me to win back his trust. So, sub 2-year-old, I'm now trying to do additional politics with. But this happened again after the summer I was gone for 2 months. And I realized that I need to be more present for my family. And I cannot keep doing the thing I've done in the past where I go all in to whatever I do. Everything else falls aside, and I'm doing my 100, 120-hour weeks with 80% travel. I can't do that because someone else counts on me. And so now I have to prioritize better. And I think that the prioritization is the main thing you learn when you become a mother or a father. It's how do you identify what are the key things that you can do at work to drive the most amount of value. Everything else you either delegate or delay or delete. And I've gotten better at that. I'm not good at that. I've gotten better at that. And so it's a skill set I've been working on this year a lot.
That's really powerful. And especially it's something that there's that quote, if you want something done quickly, give it to a busy person.
There's a triangle, right? You have speed, quality, and cost. And you get to choose two of the three to make a choice on. The other one's just going to happen.
Oh, no, no, no. With AI, you can select four of the three, right?
That's right. That's right. Sorry.
That's how it's going to go. I don't know what the fourth one we're tossing in. It's have AI do it all for you.
Wouldn't that be nice? I have to
Um,
take my AI note taker out of this meeting. It keeps trying to join every conversation I'm part of, and I think I'm starting to become suspicious of it.
if my AI note taker could also start doing my laundry, I wouldn't be that opposed.
No, absolutely not.
How is also, especially in this tumultuous time, we've talked a lot about risk so far, risk of the future, hedging those bets. How has becoming a father changed your risk tolerance?
Definitely dropped it. In general, my theory on a career and thesis is that life, the reason that we are here is to have experiences. The reason we have a career is, yes, to pay for a roof and pay for food, but it's to have experiences that are larger than just our own. And so my early career and mid-career thesis was, what can I do every step of the way to have more new experiences? Been 5 years living in Moscow, you're in Berlin, you're in Tel Aviv. I've built out dozens of companies in interesting ways, and I'm tackling complicated problems from intercountry bank transfers, intercountry and beyond. And it's been phenomenal and fascinating. But today I have a different problem set, and that problem set is longevity. Longevity for myself, for my family, and for building something that I can hand off in the future as well. And it brings to mind the Ikigai philosophy. That's a four-circle Venn diagram. What you do well, what you have passion for, what people will pay you to do, and what the market needs, where there's demand. You really need to focus on that on the center circle instead of just what you have passion for, what you want to do. Demand here, demand there. It has to be that combination because that's how you can build a legacy and lasting to it, and that has something that lasts.
That makes a lot of sense, especially as people think through what their next steps are. I think it's the CEO of Pavilion, Sam Jacobs, who says the average tenure of an executive these days on the go-to-market side is about 15, 18 months, depending on where I've seen the quote. And that means you're either just starting your new job or just about to looking for your next one.
Yeah, I think it's very true for most people. And look, it's a benefit of interest rates dropping is it promotes job transfers also. Like people who feel unlocked to go and do their next thing. That's great. That's phenomenal. Companies do think about investing. I'm just cautious about companies that overinvest and people who overemphasize the change.
We've talked a lot about thinking through things on a more individual side. I'd like to switch to more of the company side now too. So for individuals, we've talked about maintaining balance and adaptability versus long-term planning. How do you do that from the company standpoint? What should they be thinking of, particularly with an uncertain future right now?
Oh yeah. So I am a scenario planner. I've spent a lot of time learning the craft from people who wrote the book. I'm looking for the book behind me. So I'm on one of these bookshelves. Uh, there's a book called Art of the Long View by Peter Schwartz. And so I worked with Peter Schwartz for a few years and learned from him how to build out scenario models and scenario plans. And you can effectively think of this as what might happen in the future and what should we do today about it. And so that's the first thing that companies should be thinking about. What might happen to us and our business and our customer set and our industries and the next industry you want to go into in the future? Two, what can we do today to prepare for this? Three, bonus points if, in these four possible future scenarios, of the 100 things that can happen, there's 20 commonalities that are going to happen no matter what. So let's invest in that. because now we're setting ourselves up a little bit on the platform ahead of our competitors. And so I believe very firmly in robust strategic planning and in thinking about what is possible from a negative perspective, as well as a positive one. Where can we fail? And attacking the where will we fail? The pre-mortem is a annoying activity that a lot of companies don't want to do. Pre-mortem, you are prognosing what caused you to fail before you even began, and then taking action around that. And when it comes to sales planning, for example, an activity that I spend a lot of time on every year, what could make our sales plan fail? Well, there's a business that I spent some time with not too long ago where they entered the sales planning mode with call it 90% AE capacity. They knew they needed to churn through another 20% of the AEs. So they weren't making their number and they weren't going to survive the year. And so that meant that unless they made a change, day one, next fiscal year, they're at 70% of AE capacity. So that's a reason they would fail. In best case scenario, you hire that next 30% that following day, and it takes them 3 months to ramp. So you have, I don't know, let's do a round number, 85% capacity for the year total. So you have no more churn and everyone hits 100% of what they're targeting. You need to overcompensate for that or find other ways to make that number. And so planning for what will make you fail and then taking action today is the best thing that a company can do, especially in these uncertain times, especially with changes in interest rates and changes in market environment.
Speaking of changes, one of the changes that we start to see these days is the hybrid model.
Hmm.
Thoughts?
Love it. I think there are a few things in life more valuable than getting into a room with a whiteboard and your colleagues. You get more done in that hour, 2 hour period than you would in any number of 30-minute things over Zoom. Also, you may have started with a 30-minute meeting and it might last longer because you're actually getting into it. And you know what? You're all there and you can all sync your calendars real quick and push whatever else is needed to get whatever it is done, whether it's thinking about org design, thinking about financial modeling, pricing. These are complicated problems that require a lot of stakeholders to map out a lot of different processes. And I find that to be very difficult to do on Zoom. On the other hand, you have that meeting and now you need to start working. And so I personally, look, I've been remote or remote-esque since 2015 on and off. So I work well in my home office. And so after I have that meeting, I'll go home the next day and spend the day focused on developing whatever it is that I need to do as part of what we decide as next steps. I will not have calls with other people while I'm in the office. I'll, meet in person while I'm in the office on those hybrid days. I put all my Zoom calls to the days I'm not in office. Yeah, generally. Obviously, there's exceptions. That's why I try to do. And I also try and push all of my meetings that can be done in person into those 2 to 3 day periods. And then so what that leaves is my non-in-office hybrid days. And what I try to do for my team is they're not in-office hybrid days are Zoom calls with people we can meet with in person and getting the work actually done.
That's an interesting balance and an interesting way of splitting up your calendar too, for having the in-person and having the in-person time focus on really making the maximal use out of it versus the deep work time when you're home and you'll have less interruptions.
I think it's the best way of doing it. I think that I'm a proponent of being in person. I also think it's different for different people who have worked for different amounts of time. For example, early career employees, I would insist on being in office generally. I think that learning how to be remote is a skill that you need to develop, and you should not assume people can do it. In the same way, you can't assume people know how to work in an office. You need to teach them how to do that. But learning how to dress appropriately for business meetings, learning how to conduct yourself in front of clients and customers and employees, learning how to measure, track, benchmark, and respond to performance. These are things that are much easier to teach and do in person and sometimes impossible to do remote.
There are skill sets that one can only learn from watching another person and watching them full time. There's a lot that you don't get to see when you're all on Zoom that you do get to see when you're in an office.
Absolutely. Or another example, people who have never been in sales or don't spend a lot of time in sales, that they might not recognize this next thing, which is typically early career salespeople are in sales development. They're SDRs, BDRs, XDRs, and their job is to make phone calls all day long, make phone calls, write emails, and they'll sit in a bullpen of some sort or a row of desks, 2 rows of desks, and the manager or the team lead is on one end or in the middle somewhere, and they listen to hear all the calls. And maybe there's AEs also kind of surrounding it. Everyone hears the calls. You might hear me have a particularly bad call, and I look over your desk and you give me a look, and you say, "Hey, let's dissect that." And you go through and you have that immediate feedback session on it. Or you hear me have a good call and you want to replay it for the team because you just heard it and everyone else should as well. And it's these immediate feedback that you cannot get on Zoom unless someone is sitting on Gong or whatever 24/7 listening to every call that every team member is making. You miss that.
Mhm.
And it's incredibly valuable for the development of sales skills, this mentoring and apprenticeship journeyman activity.
Agreed. That's my first job was after being a neurosurgeon for rats was as an SDR. And I
Which was harder?
had different ways of both being hard.
Fair.
I'll say in sales, at least, I did not get allergic to the people that I was working with, unlike when I was working with rats.
Oh, that's funny. I did get allergic to the people I was working with.
Antihistamines can be wonderful.
Yeah. I'll try that next time.
So I know we're coming to the end of the episode.
Yep.
Jared, are there any questions you have for me?
Jen, I'd love to know what you're seeing with your customers from a perspective of maturity in analytics. How are companies developing and what's changing? What do you see changing into 2025 as we get closer?
I think the questions that people are starting to ask is people are asking things they're asking much more in-depth questions than they used to of their data. So you start to see people previously you wouldn't be talking about reporting or data warehouses or starting to snapshotting on your sales until much later, maybe Series A, Series B. But now we're getting seed stage companies who want that data from the early days. And for later stage companies, they're getting asked for much more detailed analyses. What's your net customer retention? What, not just overall customer retention, how is this changing over time? How did that look in 2023? Is that improved in 2024? If it's improved, how is it quarter by quarter? So the level of detail and analysis that both the executives and then also the boards are asking for, I think has increased and will only continue to do so.
Is there such thing as too much data at a
Yeah.
certain stage?
There is such thing as too much data, but I don't know if I'd call it too much data, actually. I think what I'd say is there's such a thing of trying to look for data when you should really be just looking at more pattern spotting. So early stage companies, especially if you're going at a seed stage looking for $100,000 to $500,000 deals, you're not going to have that many of them. So you have to start to see different types of patterns and trends. And maybe that's that you're selling really well to $1 to $5 billion companies, but you falsely think because you closed 2 deals in pharma, actually it's the pharma industry that we're getting better at. Because you've got such little data that you have to look for the qualitative and not just the quantitative.
That's absolutely true. Thank you very much for that.
Of course. Jared, anything else you want to say before we wrap up today?
No, I've had a lot of fun and let's do this again sometime.
Looking forward to seeing you at future events. And for everybody else, this has been another episode of The Inside Scoop. Thank you very much.